My name is Layla Tmaine, and I just turned 18. At my birthday party in our Boulder home last night, my father Garrett leaned in close, smelling of expensive bourbon, and the kind of desperation he thinks he hides well. He squeezed my shoulder and whispered that after the cake was served, I needed to sign some routine papers for my Uncle Silas. He called it a formality, a simple step to help the family manage the estate now that I was an adult. I didn't argue. I smiled at him, the same practiced smile I've used for years to keep the peace. Then I walked into the study, opened my laptop, and used the digital access my grandmother gave me before she passed to quietly transfer my entire $4.2 million inheritance. The ranch, the portfolios, every cent of it into an irrevocable trust. The next morning, the high-end catering leftovers were still in the fridge when the screaming started. My Uncle Silas had tried to finalize a quick flip sale of the family ranch to a resort group, but the county clerk had flagged the title. My parents and my younger sister Brooke gathered in the kitchen, their faces twisted in a mix of fury and disbelief as they realized the legal wall I'd built was impenetrable. My dad turned the color of ash. Silas, who had already signed a contract to sell land he never actually possessed, was frantically calling a lawyer. They thought they were going to spend my birthday securing their own financial future at my expense, but they were wrong. Before I tell you how my father reacted when I told him the money was gone, or what my sister did when she realized her new car wasn't coming, please hit like and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back 6 years to a summer at Bittercreek Ranch, when my grandfather Thomas said something I didn't truly understand, until I saw my father's signature on a forged deed. The summer I turned 12, my grandfather picked me up in his dusty Ford and drove me out toward the mountains. The ranch sits in a valley where the air feels thinner, and the light stays gold longer than it does in the city. The house was built by his own hands with white clapboard and a porch that looks out over 300 acres of Colorado timber. I remember my grandfather stopping the truck by the south fence line. He didn't get out right away. He just sat there looking at the land. He told me that a ranch isn't just dirt and grass, it is a history of the people who were willing to show up when the work was hard. My parents Garrett and Lydia rarely showed up. To them, Bittercreek was a burden, a place with bad cell service and too much dust. But I loved every inch of it. I spent that summer learning the rhythm of the land. I learned how to check the irrigation lines and how to tell if a fence post was rotting just by the sound it made when you tapped it. While my mother was in Boulder planning charity galas and my father was chasing bad investments, I was with Thomas. He was teaching me that family isn't always about blood. It is about whoever is standing there when the fence needs mending. By the time the sun began to set on that first day, my hands were blistered and my back ached, but I felt a sense of belonging I never felt in our modern house in the suburbs. We sat on the porch and watched the elk move across the lower meadow. Thomas handed me a cold bottle of water and looked at me with those sharp, knowing eyes. He said that one day people would come with rulers and calculators to try and measure the value of this place. He told me to remember that you can't measure a legacy in dollar signs, and you should never trust a man who tries. At 12, I thought he was just being poetic. I didn't realize he was describing my father. I didn't know that even then he was already talking to Marcus Thorne about how to keep this land from being stripped and sold by the people who were supposed to protect me. Back in Boulder, the air was always heavy with my parents' expectations, but out here I could finally breathe. My sister Brooke stayed home that summer, complaining about the heat. She didn't want the dirt under her fingernails. She wanted the status that came with the Tmaine name without ever understanding the toil it took to build it. I stayed at the ranch, and that was the beginning of a divide that would eventually lead to the explosion in our kitchen this morning. The morning sun had barely touched the granite countertops when the silence of our Boulder kitchen was shattered. It wasn't the sound of a toaster or the hum of the refrigerator. It was the shrill, jagged ringing of my father's phone. Garrett picked it up on the second ring, his posture still stiff from the previous night's festivities. I watched from the breakfast nook, my hands wrapped around a warm mug of Earl Grey, observing the way his face transitioned from casual curiosity to a mask of sheer panic. On the other end of the line, Uncle Silas was screaming so loudly I could hear the vibrations of his voice across the room. Silas was a man who lived for the quick win and the shortcut. He had spent the last 3 months coordinating a secret high-velocity sale of Bittercreek Ranch to a luxury resort conglomerate based out of Denver. He called it a quick flip away to turn dirt into liquid gold before the ink on my 18th birthday cards was even dry. But the plan had hit a brick wall. The county clerk had flagged the title and the deal was dead in the water. My mother Lydia was mid-pour, her hand frozen over a delicate porcelain cup. When Garrett repeated the words, "title flag and trust," her fingers went slack. The mug hit the floor, shattering into 1,000 white shards. But she didn't even look down. The splash of dark coffee stained her cream-colored silk robe, but she was focused entirely on my father's crumbling expression. Garrett's eyes darted to me, then back to the phone, then to the laptop sitting open on the counter. He realized in that heartbeat that the millions of dollars he had already spent in his mind were gone. They had cornered me before I could even set my tea down. Their faces were twisted in a grotesque combination of fury and pure disbelief, a look I had never seen directed at me in 18 years of being the quiet, compliant daughter. Garrett stepped toward me, his voice cracking under the hidden pressure of a $300,000 debt he had secretly accumulated through a string of failed logistics startups. He demanded to know exactly what I had done, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the table. I didn't flinch. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. I told him very clearly that I had simply accepted the gift my grandparents intended for me to have. I explained that the ranch and the investment portfolios were no longer assets they could leverage for their own bailouts. The realization that their teenage daughter had outmaneuvered them made Lydia's face go completely ashen. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was the sudden, violent death of their perceived authority. They had spent my entire life viewing me as a pawn, a placeholder for their future wealth, and in one evening I had flipped the board. Lydia finally found her voice, but it wasn't the polished socialite tone she used at her garden club meetings. It was a low, dangerous hiss. She accused me of being cold and calculating, of betraying the family that had provided me with everything. I looked around the kitchen at the high-end appliances they couldn't afford, and the designer clothes Lydia wore while Thomas was dying in a shared room at a state facility. I reminded her that while they were busy trying to sell a legacy they never built, I was the one who actually sat by Grandpa's bed. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it could shatter, just like the coffee mug. But just as Garrett opened his mouth to deliver an ultimatum, the front door chimes rang. It was Silas. He didn't wait to be let in. He burst into the kitchen, his tie crooked and his forehead beaded with sweat. He looked at me like I was a stranger, a threat he hadn't accounted for in his spreadsheets. Silas slammed a folder onto the island, claiming that he had already signed a binding contract with the resort group. He yelled that he was personally liable for the deposit if the sale didn't go through. He looked at Garrett, pleading for him to talk some sense into me, but Garrett was staring at the floor, realizing the gravity of the legal wall I had constructed. Silas turned his rage on me, threatening to bring in a team of lawyers to prove that I had exerted undue influence over my grandparents in their final days. He painted a picture of me as a manipulative child who had tricked two elderly people into signing over their life's work. It was a desperate move, and we all knew it. My grandparents weren't confused. They were observant. They had watched Silas burn through his own inheritance in less than 2 years, and they had watched Garrett treat every family asset like a personal piggy bank. I told Silas that Marcus Thorne, the estate attorney, had a video of my grandfather Thomas explaining exactly why this trust was created. The mention of Marcus's name acted like a physical blow. Marcus was a man of impeccable reputation, a legal shark who didn't lose. The room went silent again, but this time it was heavy with the weight of looming consequences. Silas realized he wasn't just fighting a girl. He was fighting the ghost of Thomas Tmaine and the best legal mind in the state. He slumped into a chair, his bravado evaporating. But Lydia wasn't ready to give up. She shifted tactics, her eyes welling with practiced tears. She started talking about the family's survival, about the debts they had incurred trying to keep up appearances for my sake and for Brooke's. She tried to make me feel responsible for the house we lived in and the life we led. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, but I had seen the ledger. I knew the truth. The drama took a sharper turn when my younger sister Brooke walked into the kitchen. She was 17, clutching her phone and looking at us with a confused frown. She had been promised a brand new luxury SUV for her graduation, a vehicle Garrett had told her was already paid for. When she saw the broken mug on the floor and our mother's tear-stained face, she asked if something was wrong with the car. The silence that followed was deafening. Garrett couldn't look her in the eye. He had to tell her right there in front of all of us that the money for the car was tied up in the ranch sale that wasn't happening. Brooke's face went from confusion to a sharp, bratty anger. She didn't blame our father for lying to her or Silas for his greed. She turned her eyes on me, her favorite target, and demanded to know why I was ruining her life. It was the perfect snapshot of the Tmaine family dynamic. My sister's vanity, my mother's manipulation, and my father's weakness, all swirling around a pile of money that didn't belong to them. Brooke started screaming that I was selfish, that I didn't need $4 million while she had to drive a 5-year-old sedan. She didn't understand that the money wasn't just for me. It was for the preservation of the land, for the scholarships Thomas wanted to fund, and for a future that didn't involve clearing out his life's work for a quick commission. I watched her, feeling a deep sense of pity. She was the product of their values, a girl who measured her worth in horsepower and leather seats. I told her that if she wanted a new car, she could get a job at the ranch this summer and earn it. That suggestion was the final spark. Brooke threw her phone onto the counter and stormed out, her footsteps echoing up the stairs. Silas stood up, clutching his folder, and told Garrett that they needed to find a way to break the trust, or they were all going under. He didn't care about the family. He only cared about his signed contract and the furious developers who were undoubtedly blowing up his phone. He left without saying another word, leaving me alone with my parents. Garrett finally looked up, his eyes hard and cold. He told me that if I didn't cooperate, if I didn't find a way to give them access to at least a portion of the funds, I was no longer welcome under his roof. He was giving me an ultimatum on the day after my 18th birthday. He was willing to trade his daughter for a chance to pay off his bad bets. I stood my ground, my voice calm and unwavering. I told him that I would be packed by noon. I had already made arrangements to stay at the ranch house, the one place where I felt the presence of the people who actually loved me. Lydia let out a strangled sob, but she didn't try to stop me. She was already calculating how this would look to her friends, how she would explain her daughter's sudden departure without revealing the financial collapse that was coming for them. As I walked out of the kitchen, I could hear them starting to argue with each other, the blame shifting back and forth like a poisoned ball. They were so focused on their own survival that they didn't even notice the small leather notebook I had tucked under my arm. It was the ledger I had found in Grandpa's desk, the one that held the final piece of the puzzle, a secret that would ensure they never laid a finger on Bittercreek again. I stepped out into the crisp Colorado air, knowing that this was only the beginning of a war they were destined to lose. To truly grasp why the air in our Boulder kitchen felt like a battlefield, you have to look beyond the broken porcelain and the screaming matches of today. You have to drive 2 hours west, where the asphalt gives way to gravel and the skyline is dominated by the jagged peaks of the Rockies rather than the glass towers of Denver. To understand the root of my defiance, you have to find the ghost of Bittercreek Ranch. It was there during the summer I turned 12 that the foundation of my life was built, while the foundation of my relationship with my parents began to crumble into the mountain soil. My grandfather Thomas was a man who spoke in actions, a pioneer soul who believed that if a job was worth doing, it was worth doing slowly enough to learn its secrets. I remember the morning he handed me a heavy leather tool belt that sagged against my hips. We spent 6 hours under a relentless Colorado sun mending the south fence line. He didn't just show me how to hammer a staple into a post. He taught me to feel the grain of the cedar, to listen for the resonance of the wire, and to understand that a fence is only as strong as the patience of the person who built it. He told me that most people in this world are in such a rush to finish that they never actually start. My parents, Garrett and Lydia, were the definition of those people. To them, Bittercreek was never a home or a heritage, it was an inconvenience. It was what they called sentimental junk in private and wasted equity in front of their financial advisors. Whenever they were forced to visit, they acted like political refugees in a hostile territory. My mother would spend the entire weekend pacing the porch, waving her phone in the air, and complaining about the lack of high-speed internet, or the way the mountain air made her skin feel dry. My father would spend his time staring at the expansive meadows, not seeing the elk or the beauty of the timber, but performing mental math on the development value of the acreage. Thomas saw it all. He watched them from his armchair, his eyes sharp and weary, as they measured his life's work in dollar signs while he was still very much alive. He saw the way they looked at his weathered hands and his dusty boots, with a mixture of pity and barely concealed greed. During those summers, I became the ranch's shadow. While my sister Brooke refused to leave the air-conditioned guest room for fear of ruining her manicure, I was in the barn learning where the pipes tended to freeze in January and how to bleed the air from the old tractor's fuel line. I knew exactly where the property lines were marked by rusted iron stakes hidden beneath the sagebrush, and I knew which sections of the creek bed would hold water even in a drought year. I was learning the language of the land, while my parents were busy learning the language of foreclosure and high-interest loans in the city. Thomas once pulled me aside after a long day of clearing brush and told me something that has become my North Star. He said that family isn't always about shared blood, Layla. It is about whoever actually shows up when the work needs doing. I was the only one who showed up. For 6 long years, as his health began to decline, I was the one making the drive every weekend. I was the one who knew his medication schedule and which floorboards in the hallway creaked enough to wake him from a nap. My parents stayed in their suburban bubble, sending expensive gift baskets they didn't pick out, and making brief performative phone calls that always ended with a question about the estate or the rising property taxes in the county. They weren't mourning a father. They were a pair of vultures circling a dying mountain, waiting for the wind to stop, so they could finally descend and strip the meat from the bone. They stayed in the city and waited for him to die, never realizing that the more they pulled away, the more Thomas was pouring his legacy into me. The conflict of today was born in those quiet moments on the ranch porch. My father's secret $300,000 debt didn't happen overnight. It was the result of a decade of trying to live a $4.2 million lifestyle on a reality that was rapidly shrinking. He viewed his father's ranch as his personal safety net, a golden parachute that would deploy the moment the old man took his last breath. He never considered that the quiet girl sitting in the corner with a book was actually the one holding the scissors to the strings. He underestimated my loyalty to Thomas just as much as he overestimated my fear of his anger. He thought the title to Bittercreek was his birthright, but in the eyes of the man who built it, birthright had to be earned with sweat and presence. The drama reached a new peak when my father realized the scope of his miscalculation. Standing there in the kitchen, Garrett looked at me and realized I wasn't the daughter he remembered. I was a Tmaine built from the same hard wood as my grandfather. He tried to claim that Thomas wasn't in his right mind during his final year, that I had used the isolation of the ranch to manipulate a lonely old man. It was a vile accusation, but it was the only weapon he had left. He didn't know that Marcus Thorne had documented every single visit, every medical consultation, and every conversation. He didn't know that the ranch's shadow had kept a ledger of her own. As Garrett's face turned from ash to a deep bruised purple, he grabbed his car keys and told Lydia to get in the car. They were going to the ranch. He seemed to think that physical possession would somehow override a legal trust. He believed that if he stood on the dirt, he could reclaim the authority he had lost. He looked at me with a chilling lack of affection and told me that he would have me removed for trespassing by sundown. The threat was empty, but the intent was jagged. He was willing to use the police against his own child to secure a payday. I watched them pull out of the driveway, the tires of their luxury car spitting gravel against the manicured lawn, and I felt a strange sense of calm. They were heading into a trap they had set for themselves 20 years ago. The move to the ranch wasn't just a change of scenery, it was an escalation into a war of attrition. Brooke was in the back seat crying because the Wi-Fi at Bittercreek was non-existent and her social life was effectively over. She saw herself as a victim of my cruelty, never pausing to ask why our father was so desperate to sell the only home our family had truly ever had. She followed their lead, seeing the world through a lens of entitlement that blinded her to the reality of the situation. I let them go. I knew the ranch better than they did. I knew that the iron stakes marking the property lines were more than just boundaries of dirt. They were the borders of my grandfather's protection. I stayed behind in the Boulder house for exactly 1 hour, long enough to pack my essentials into 2 sturdy bags. I didn't take the expensive jewelry my mother had bought me to match her own. I didn't take the designer clothes that were meant to make me look like a Tmaine in a country club. I took my work boots, my grandfather's old denim jacket, and the leather notebook that contained the truth. As I drove toward the mountains, I could see the storm clouds gathering over the peaks. In Colorado, weather changes in a heartbeat, and the winds of Bittercreek are known for their ability to knock a person off their feet if they aren't braced for the impact. My parents were about to find out that they had no roots on that land, and without roots you are just something for the storm to carry away. When I reached the ranch gate, I saw their car parked haphazardly in the grass. Garrett was standing by the porch, looking at the heavy padlocks I had installed the week before. The new conflict was standing right there in the tall grass, and this time there would be no polite silence to protect him from the truth. The heavy iron padlocks on the ranch house remained cold and unyielding beneath my father's white-knuckled grip. As I pulled my truck into the gravel turnaround, the headlights caught the glint of the silver Mercedes my parents had leased to keep up appearances in Boulder, now looking absurdly out of place against the rugged backdrop of Bittercreek. Garrett spun around his face, a mask of indignation, but the primary source of the noise wasn't him. It was Brooke. She was standing by the porch steps, her designer sneakers sinking into the damp Colorado soil, wailing as if the world had ended. To understand Brooke, you have to understand the price of being the golden child. For 17 years, she had been the sun around which my parents' vanity orbited. She was the one who got the private tutors, the horse riding lessons she quit after 2 weeks, and the constant stream of high-end electronics. She had been raised to believe that the world existed to cater to her whims, and my parents had reinforced that delusion by promising her a brand new luxury SUV for her high school graduation. That vehicle was supposed to be her trophy, a symbol of her entry into the elite circles of Boulder society. The problem was that Garrett and Lydia had funded that promise with money they didn't have. They had banked everything on the secret sale of Bittercreek Ranch, effectively selling my grandfather's bones to put a teenager in a car that cost more than a year of college tuition. Now that the trust had frozen every cent of the Tmaine estate, Brooke's carefully curated lifestyle was disintegrating before her eyes. She didn't see the $300,000 debt our father had hidden in the shadows. She didn't see the predatory contract Uncle Silas had signed with the resort developers. All she saw was her older sister standing between her and a leather interior status symbol. Brooke lunged towards me the moment I stepped out of the truck, her voice shrill and trembling with a bratty, unearned rage. She screamed that I was a thief, that I was stealing her future and ruining her life, because I wanted to play cowgirl on a piece of dirt that nobody cared about. It was a staggering display of entitlement, but it was exactly what our parents had cultivated. Lydia stepped in then, not to calm Brooke down, but to use her as a human shield. She looked at me with those practiced weeping eyes and asked how I could be so cruel to my own sister. She tried to frame the entire legal battle as a personal vendetta I was holding against a teenager. It was a classic move in the Tmaine household, shifting the focus from their systemic greed to a fabricated emotional crisis. The drama intensified when Garrett realized that his displays of physical intimidation weren't working. He stepped away from the locked door and smoothed his expensive jacket, shifting into what he called his negotiation mode. It was the same tone he used when he was trying to convince investors to fund his failing startups. He told me that we were all family and that families made compromises. He proposed a bridge to close the gap between us. He offered me what he termed a seat at the table. If I agreed to dissolve the trust and allow the sale to Silas's developers to proceed, he would personally guarantee me $75,000 for my college education. He said it as if he were handing me the keys to the kingdom, his chest puffed out with a patronizing generosity. I stood there in the quiet of the mountain air, listening to the wind whistle through the pines, and I almost laughed. It was an insult disguised as a paternal gesture. He was attempting to buy back his own theft with a tiny fraction of the millions he intended to squander. He wanted me to hand over $4.2 million in land and investments in exchange for a sum that wouldn't even cover 3 years at a top-tier university. He was treating me like a child who didn't understand the value of a dollar, unaware that I was the only one in the family who had actually read the quarterly earnings reports Marcus Thorne had sent to the ranch. I looked him directly in the eye and told him that my grandparents hadn't left me a seat at his table. They had left me the entire house, the land it sat on, and the table itself. The rejection hit Garrett like a physical blow. The mask of the reasonable negotiator shattered, revealing the desperate, debt-ridden man underneath. He began to pace the gravel, shouting that I was being unreasonable, that I was going to bankrupt the family name and leave us with nothing but a pile of rocks and old timber. Brooke joined in her crying, turning into a rhythmic chant of selfishness. She demanded to know why her car had to be sacrificed for a ranch Thomas hadn't even used in his final months. The cruelty of her words didn't surprise me. She had been taught that people were only valuable as long as they were useful, and in her eyes, our grandfather had ceased to be useful the moment he stopped signing checks. Lydia tried a different angle, stepping closer and lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. She told me that Silas was in serious trouble, that the resort group was threatening a massive lawsuit for breach of contract if the title wasn't cleared by the end of the month. She said that if Silas went down, he would take Garrett with him, and the family would be disgraced in every social circle from Boulder to Aspen. She was trying to make me responsible for their criminal shortcuts. I reminded her that Silas had signed that contract knowing he didn't own the property, and Garrett had encouraged him. I told her that in the real world, that wasn't a family tragedy, it was fraud. The conflict reached a fever pitch when Brooke grabbed a heavy rock from the landscaping and threatened to smash the window of the ranch house if I didn't hand over the keys. She was having a full-scale tantrum, driven by the sudden realization that her social standing was tied to a sister she had spent years mocking. Garrett didn't stop her. He watched with a grim sort of hope, as if a broken window would somehow break the irrevocable trust. I didn't move. I simply pulled out my phone and reminded them that the ranch was now under the protection of a private security firm and that the local sheriff was a close friend of Marcus Thorne. The rock dropped from Brooke's hand, thudding into the dirt, as the reality of their powerlessness finally began to sink in. They were trapped in a prison of their own making. They had spent 20 years waiting for a windfall, neglecting the man who built the fortune and the daughter who guarded it. Now the golden child's price was being called due, and they had no currency to pay it. Garrett looked at the ranch house, then at me, and I saw a flicker of something new in his eyes, not just anger, but a budding, jagged fear. He realized that the daughter he had dismissed as the quiet librarian-to-be was actually the one holding the keys to his survival. As the light began to fade over the valley, casting long skeletal shadows across the porch, I told them they could stay in the guest cabin for the night, but only if they stayed away from the main house. It was a small mercy, one they didn't deserve, but I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it because the ranch deserved peace. As they trudged toward the smaller building, Brooke still grumbling about the lack of a decent mattress, and Lydia clutching her ruined silk robe, I felt the first drops of rain. The Colorado storm was finally moving in, and as I walked toward the south fence line to check the latches, I saw a black SUV pulling up to the gate. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't the resort developers. It was Marcus Thorne, and the look on his face told me that Silas had done something even more desperate than I had imagined. The new conflict was arriving through the rain, and this time it carried the weight of a criminal indictment. The black SUV came to a halt near the porch, its tires crunching over the wet gravel with a heavy rhythmic finality. Marcus Thorne stepped out into the rain unbothered by the Colorado chill. To look at him was to see a man who had spent 40 years interpreting the fine print of human greed. He was lean-dressed in a charcoal overcoat that seemed as structured as a fortress, and he carried a leather briefcase that felt less like an accessory and more like a blunt force weapon. Marcus had been my grandparents' silent partner for decades, the man who helped my grandfather Thomas navigate the complexities of building a multi-million-dollar supply empire from a single truck and a handshake. He was a legal sentinel, a man who didn't deal in emotions, only in facts, and the irrevocable nature of the law. My parents, Garrett and Lydia, watched him from the shadows of the guest cabin porch, their faces tightening with a new, sharper kind of dread. Marcus walked towards the main house, acknowledging me with a brief, respectful nod before turning his attention to my father. Garrett tried to summon his old Boulder executive charm, straightening his damp jacket and stepping into the light. He greeted Marcus with a forced, hollow warmth, but Marcus didn't offer his hand. He simply set his briefcase on the porch railing, the click of the brass latches echoing like a gunshot in the mountain air. My father immediately shifted into his prepped defense. He started talking about the family's concern for my grandfather's mental state during his final year. He used phrases like cognitive decline and diminished capacity, suggesting that I had exploited a confused old man to secure my own future. Lydia joined in, her voice trembling with a rehearsed sorrow, claiming that Thomas hadn't known what he was signing when he established the trust. They were playing their final card, attempting to paint a picture of elder abuse to invalidate the legal wall I had built. Marcus didn't interrupt them. He didn't argue or point out the obvious desperation in their voices. He simply reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sleek, modern tablet. He told them that Thomas had anticipated this exact conversation and had insisted on providing a personal clarification. Marcus pressed play and turned the screen toward my parents. The video was crisp, shot in high definition in the very living room we were standing near. There sat my grandfather Thomas in his favorite wingback chair. He looked healthier than I had seen him in years, his eyes sharp and filled with a terrifyingly lucid focus. He wasn't a man lost in the fog of age. He was a man who had finally run out of patience. In the video, Thomas spoke directly into the lens, his voice steady and resonant. He began by stating the date and the time, confirming his presence of mind with a series of cognitive markers that would satisfy any probate judge in the country. Then he began to dismantle my father's life. He detailed every single time Garrett had come to the ranch not to visit, but to beg for a bailout. He listed the dates, the exact amounts, and the failed business ventures that had swallowed his hard-earned money. He spoke about the $30,000 for a logistics firm that didn't exist, and the $50,000 for a restaurant that never opened its doors. He revealed that he had kept every single receipt and every bounced check my father had ever handed him. Garrett flinched, his face turning a deep bruised shade of red as his father's voice filled the porch. The video then turned to my mother. Thomas described the 3 weeks he spent in the hospital with pneumonia, a time when he was supposedly too confused to know who was there. He pointed out that while I had slept in a chair beside his bed for 11 nights, Lydia had ignored every single call from the nursing staff. He mentioned that when she finally did show up, she spent 14 minutes on her phone taking a photograph for social media before claiming she had a charity gala to attend. It wasn't just a legal document. It was a character assassination from beyond the grave. Thomas explained that he wasn't creating the trust to punish them. He was creating it because he refused to let the land he bled for be used to subsidize their vanity and their incompetence. He said very clearly that he chose me because I was the only Tmaine who understood that a legacy is a responsibility, not a lottery ticket. When the video ended, the silence on the porch was deafening. The only sound was the rain hitting the metal roof and the heavy, ragged breathing of my father. Garrett looked like he had been physically struck. The father he had spent 20 years waiting to die had just reached out from the void to tell him exactly what he thought of him. Lydia was staring at the tablet screen, her mouth slightly open, the socialite mask finally shattered into a million pieces. They had tried to claim he was confused, but the man on that screen was the most coherent person in the family. Marcus took the tablet back and tucked it into his briefcase with a clinical precision. He told Garrett that he had several other recordings, including testimonies from the doctors who had performed the competency evaluations. He made it clear that any attempt to contest the trust on the grounds of diminished capacity would result in a public trial where these videos would be entered into the permanent record. The conflict didn't end there. Marcus turned to me and lowered his voice, his expression shifting to something more urgent. He told me that while the video was a strong defense, we had a more immediate problem. Uncle Silas, realizing that the resort deal was dead and his creditors were closing in, had gone to the county records office earlier that afternoon. He hadn't just tried to flip the ranch, he had attempted to file a quitclaim deed using a signature that looked suspiciously like a forgery of my own. Silas was so deep in the hole that he had crossed the line into felony fraud. Marcus warned me that the resort developers were already threatening to file a massive racketeering lawsuit against anyone with the Tmaine name. My father's secret debt was no longer just a family embarrassment. It was now a criminal liability that could pull me into the path of a federal investigation. Garrett, hearing this, didn't offer to help or apologize. He turned on Silas, calling him a fool for getting caught, even though we all knew Garrett had been the one pushing for the quick sale. The two brothers had spent their lives enabling each other's worst instincts, and now the floor was falling out from under both of them. My mother started to panic, asking Marcus if the trust could be used to pay for a criminal defense attorney for Silas. Marcus looked at her with a chilling sort of pity and reminded her that the trust was designed to protect the assets, not the people who tried to steal them. He told her that under no circumstances would a single cent of my grandfather's money be used to shield Silas from the consequences of his own forgery. Brooke, who had been listening from the edge of the porch, burst into tears again. She didn't understand the legalities, but she understood that the family name was being dragged through the dirt. She looked at me, her face red and blotchy, and asked if I was happy now that Uncle Silas was going to jail. It was the same old refrain, the golden child blaming the only person who was actually following the rules. I didn't answer her. I looked at Marcus and asked what our next move was. He told me that we needed to head to the sheriff's office immediately. Silas had gone missing after the county clerk flagged the deed, and there were rumors that he was headed toward the ranch to find the original title papers he thought were hidden in the house. Just as Marcus finished speaking, a set of headlights appeared at the end of the long driveway. A vehicle was speeding toward the house, fishtailing in the mud and kicking up a spray of gray slush. It wasn't the sheriff. It was Silas's old, battered truck. He wasn't coming to talk. He was coming out of sheer, unadulterated desperation. My father stepped forward, shouting for Silas to stop, but the truck didn't slow down. It slammed into the south fence line, the very fence Thomas and I had mended 6 years ago, splintering the cedar posts and sending a shower of sparks into the dark. Silas stumbled out of the cab, clutching a heavy metal pry bar, his eyes wild and unfocused. The legal sentinel Marcus Thorne reached into his coat, not for a weapon, but for his phone, already dialing the authorities. The conflict was no longer about boardrooms and trusts. It had turned into a desperate, dangerous physical confrontation on the land Thomas had tried so hard to protect. Silas began to run toward the porch, shouting that he wasn't going to let a girl take what was rightfully his. The splintering of the south fence line under the weight of Silas's truck felt like the final snap of the Tmaine family's moral compass. Silas lunged toward the porch, his face a distorted mask of sweat and desperation, the heavy metal pry bar swinging in his hand like a pendulum of ruin. He wasn't just fighting for money anymore. He was fighting to keep the walls of a prison from closing in. Earlier that afternoon, driven to a breaking point by the looming racketeering lawsuit from the resort developers, Silas had crossed a line that transformed our family dispute into a federal investigation. He had walked into the county records office and attempted to file a forged quitclaim deed, a document he believed would bypass the trust and grant him immediate ownership of Bittercreek Ranch. To pull off the deception, he had dug through an old desk in my grandfather's former office and found a dusty, long-forgotten notary stamp from a clerk who had passed away years ago. He had spent hours practicing my signature, trying to mimic the slant and the weight of my hand, convinced that a low-level county employee wouldn't look too closely at the paperwork for a rural ranch. But he had fundamentally underestimated Marcus Thorne's foresight. Weeks before my 18th birthday, Marcus had filed a formal notice of pending interest against every parcel of land owned by the Tmaine estate. This legal red flag acted like a silent alarm. The moment Silas pushed that forged deed across the counter, the county clerk's computer screen began to glow with warnings. The police were notified before Silas had even walked back to his truck. Now, as he stood on the porch steps, panting and waving that iron bar, the reality of his felony fraud charges was finally sinking in. But the crisis didn't stop with Silas. The investigation had already revealed a string of emails and text messages between him and my father, Garrett. My father hadn't just watched from the sidelines. He had been an active participant, encouraging the forgery and even helping Silas draft the fraudulent language in the deed. Garrett had been so blinded by his $300,000 debt and his desire for a bailout that he had implicated himself as a criminal accomplice. Our family home was no longer a place of birthday celebrations and catering. It had been officially reclassified as a crime scene. Lydia let out a piercing cry when Marcus calmly explained that the sheriff was already on his way with a warrant for both brothers. She threw herself between Marcus and my father, her expensive silk robe now tattered and stained with mountain mud. She turned to me, her voice a shrill, hysterical plea. She begged me to drop the charges, to tell the police it was all a big misunderstanding, and to save the family name from the front pages of the Boulder papers. She spoke about the country club, about Brooke's social standing, and about the decades of status they had worked so hard to maintain. She was still trying to manage the optics of a collapse that had already gone subterranean. I looked at my mother, seeing the hollow core of her concern. Even with her husband facing a prison sentence, she was worried about her reputation among people who didn't even like her. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. I reminded her that it wasn't my name they had dragged through the dirt. It was my grandfather's. They had tried to steal his legacy and forge his granddaughter's identity to pay for their vanity. Marcus stepped forward, then his presence as unyielding as a mountain ridge. He reminded my mother that the trust was irrevocable, and that I was the beneficiary, not the prosecutor. He told her that once the gears of the justice system begin to turn on a felony fraud of this magnitude, there is no stopping them. The state of Colorado was now the complainant, and the evidence Silas had created with that fake notary stamp was a permanent part of the public record. Garrett finally broke. He sank onto the porch bench, his head in his hands, the blazer he had worn so proudly now looking like a shroud. He didn't look at Silas, who was now leaning against a pillar, the pry bar falling from his nerveless fingers. My father looked at me, but it wasn't with the patronizing gaze of a parent. It was the look of a man who realized he had traded his daughter's respect for a chance at a lottery win he never deserved. He had waited 20 years for Thomas to die so he could finally be a millionaire, and instead he had ended up a felon on his own father's porch. The drama escalated as the first set of blue and red lights began to reflect off the low-hanging storm clouds. The local sheriff's department didn't arrive with sirens blaring. They moved with a quiet professional efficiency that was far more terrifying. They stepped out of their cruisers, their raincoats glistening under the floodlights. Marcus Thorne stepped forward to facilitate the process, handing over the digital files that Thomas had recorded, proving that the brothers had been warned of the trust's existence long before they attempted the forgery. This wasn't just about a bad signature anymore. It was about intent, premeditation, and the systematic attempt to defraud a protected estate. Brooke appeared in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes wide with a terror that finally bypassed her typical bratty indignation. She watched as the deputies approached her father and her uncle. She saw the silver handcuffs glinting in the rain. For the first time, the reality of her parents' greed hit her, not as a lack of a new car, but as the total destruction of her world. She screamed as they led Garrett away, her voice echoing through the valley and bouncing off the timber. She turned to me, her features contorted with a visceral, jagged hatred, and told me that I had destroyed this family. She didn't blame the forgery or the debt. She blamed the person who refused to participate in the lie. As they loaded Silas and Garrett into the back of the cruisers, Lydia collapsed into a chair, sobbing into her hands. The resort developers' lawyers were likely already drafting their racketeering suit, and the Boulder house would be seized by the bank within weeks. They had nothing left. But the biggest shock was yet to come. Marcus Thorne walked back to the porch, his phone still in his hand, and told me he had just received an urgent message from the records office. It turned out Silas hadn't just tried to forge my signature on a deed for the ranch. He had attempted to use that same fake notary stamp to take out a massive predatory loan against the family's investment portfolios, a loan that had already been processed and moved into a shielded offshore account. My breath caught in my throat. If that money had been moved, it meant Silas had a partner we hadn't accounted for. Marcus looked at the retreating police cars and then back at the guest cabin. He told me that based on the transaction logs, the person who had authorized the final transfer wasn't Garrett or Silas. It was someone with high-level access to the Tmaine digital accounts, someone who had been quietly skimming from the interest for years. I looked at my mother, who was still weeping on the bench, and then at Brooke, who was staring at her phone with a strange, fixed intensity. The family business wasn't just a crime scene. It was a nest of vipers, and the true architect of the collapse was still standing on the porch. The gears of justice were turning, but they were about to grind over a secret that would make the forgery look like child's play. I realized then that I wasn't just guarding a ranch. I was sitting on the edge of a financial explosion that would leave absolutely no survivors. The arrest of my father and uncle left a hollow, vibrating silence in the Colorado air, but the legal machinery didn't stop to let us catch our breath. Within 10 days of the forgery charges, the house of cards Garrett had built in Boulder finally came crashing down. His logistics company didn't just fail, it dissolved under the weight of accumulated debt and the sudden withdrawal of investors who wanted nothing to do with a man implicated in felony fraud. The bank moved with a cold, predatory speed I'd never witnessed initiating foreclosure on our suburban home. I watched from a distance as my mother Lydia scrambled to pack her designer life into cardboard boxes, her social standing now as tattered as the reputation she had tried so hard to protect. In their final act of desperation, they did exactly what my grandfather Thomas had predicted. They loaded their remaining belongings into a U-Haul and retreated to Bittercreek Ranch, convinced that the land was their birthright and that they could simply squat there until the legal storm passed. To Garrett and Lydia, the ranch was still just family land, a private refuge where the rules of the city didn't apply. They didn't understand the fundamental shift in reality that the irrevocable trust had created. They viewed the title to the house Thomas had built with his own hands as a mere technicality, something they could ignore because they shared his last name. When I pulled up to the ranch gates 2 days later, I found a scene that made my blood run cold. Brooke, who had traded her graduation grief for a sharp, defiant recklessness, was throwing a party. Music was blaring from the windows of the main house, a structure that was supposed to be a sanctuary. Several cars I didn't recognize were parked haphazardly on the pristine mountain grass, and the smell of cheap beer and cigarette smoke drifted through the timber. It was a desecration of the peace I had worked so hard to preserve. I stepped onto the porch, my boots echoing with a heavy, rhythmic finality that finally cut through the noise. The interior of the house was a disaster. Lydia was in the kitchen trying to organize a pantry that didn't belong to her, while Brooke and a group of her friends from the city were lounging on the handcrafted furniture, treating the living room like a cheap vacation rental. My mother looked at me, her expression a mix of exhaustion and a lingering delusional sense of ownership. She told me they had nowhere else to go, and that as my parents, they had a right to stay in the family home. Garrett emerged from the study looking aged and gray, his bravado replaced by a surly, quiet entitlement. He told me that he wouldn't be bullied off his own father's land by his own daughter. The clash was explosive, but it wasn't a shouting match. It was a collision of two completely different versions of reality. Brooke stood up, her face flushed with a bratty defiance, and told me that I was being a power-tripping narcissist. She claimed that the ranch was plenty big enough for everyone, and that I was just being selfish for wanting it all to myself. I looked at the muddy footprints on the hardwood floors Thomas had polished, and the half-empty bottles left on the antique tables. I realized then that they didn't just want a place to live. They wanted to colonize the only place I felt safe, turning a legacy of hard work into a dumping ground for their failures. My parents were counting on my guilt, banking on the idea that I wouldn't have the stomach to throw my own family into the street. I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't reach for my phone to report them for trespassing. Instead, I reached into my denim jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. I handed it to my father, who took it with a confused, trembling hand. It wasn't an eviction notice, but it was something far more permanent. I had brought a formal lease agreement drafted by Marcus Thorne outlining the terms of their residency. I told them that if they wanted to stay on the ranch, they would do so as tenants at will, not owners. They would have to pay a monthly rent to the trust, a figure based on the current market value of a 300-acre estate. I explained that every cent of that money would be funneled directly into the ranch's conservation fund, paying for the fence repairs Silas had caused and the long-neglected maintenance of the timberlands. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the eviction paradox. By staying, they were officially acknowledging that I was the landlord and they were the authorized occupants. They were being forced to fund the very legacy they had tried to sell. Lydia stared at the document, her eyes filling with a jagged, bitter realization. She asked where they were supposed to get that kind of money now that the Boulder house was gone and Garrett's income had vanished. I looked at the designer watch on her wrist and the expensive jewelry she was still wearing. I told her that the trust didn't care where the money came from, only that it was paid on time. I was offering them a roof, but I was stripping away the last of their dignity. Garrett looked at the lease, then at the house, and finally at me. He realized that the daughter he had dismissed as a quiet observer had just turned his life into a commercial transaction. He was being made a stranger in his father's house, subject to the rules of a trust he couldn't break and a daughter he couldn't manipulate. Brooke started to scream again, calling me a monster and a traitor. But the noise felt distant now, like a storm moving out of the valley. She didn't understand that I wasn't doing this out of malice. I was doing it because the land didn't owe them a living, and Thomas had been very clear that the ranch was for the people who were willing to do the work. If they weren't going to work the soil, they were going to pay for the privilege of standing on it. The surprising part wasn't that they signed. They had no other choice. They were trapped between a foreclosure in the city and a lease in the mountains. My father signed the document on the very table where Thomas used to sit and plan the year's harvest, his signature shaky and small. As I took the papers back, I told them that the party ended now. I informed Brooke's friends that they had 5 minutes to clear the property before I reported the unauthorized vehicles to the county towing service. The room cleared in a heartbeat, leaving the house quiet once again save for the sound of Lydia's muffled sobbing. The satisfaction didn't come from seeing them broken. It came from the knowledge that for the first time in 20 years, the ranch was being treated with the respect the law demanded. I walked out to the porch, the signed lease in my hand, and looked toward the south fence line. The conflict was far from over, but the boundaries were finally clear. My parents were no longer the protectors or the owners. They were guests on a mountain that had already forgotten them. But as I turned to walk toward my truck, I saw a light flickering in the window of the old tool shed near the barn. Someone was inside, moving through the shadows of the building where Thomas had kept his private records. It wasn't my parents, and it wasn't Marcus. I realized then that while I had been focused on the front door, the true architect of the family's financial schemes was still operating in the dark, and the next conflict was already unfolding in the one place I hadn't thought to check. I gripped the lease tighter, knowing that the eviction was just the first step in a much longer, much more dangerous game of survival. The flickering light in the tool shed was gone by the time I reached the barn, leaving behind nothing but the scent of damp earth and the distant rhythmic creaking of the windmill. I didn't find a squatter or a thief. Instead, beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of the workshop, where my grandfather Thomas used to spend his winter mornings, I found the true heart of Bittercreek Ranch. It was a small leather-bound notebook, its cover worn soft by years of handling, and the edges stained with the red dust of the Colorado plains. I took it back to the main house, avoiding the living room where my mother was still mourning her social standing. I sat at the heavy oak table in the kitchen, the signed lease agreement still resting there like a cold indictment, and I opened the first page. It wasn't a diary filled with the emotional ramblings of a lonely man. It was a ledger. It was a meticulous, data-driven record of presence and absence. For 20 years, Thomas had been a silent observer of his own family's neglect. He had cataloged every single Sunday visit I had made since I was 12 years old, noting the time I arrived, the work we did together, and even the small things we discussed over coffee. Beneath my name were hundreds of entries, a chronological map of a granddaughter who chose to show up. But the ledger held a darker side. On the opposing pages, Thomas had recorded every single phone call my father Garrett had ignored. He had documented the missed birthdays, the holidays spent waiting for a vehicle that never pulled into the driveway, and the brief 10-minute visits where Garrett would only stay long enough to ask about the state of the investment accounts. Thomas had been counting. He hadn't been the confused, aging man my parents described to their friends. He had been a bookkeeper of character. He had noted the exact date in 2019 when Garrett had sold the Boulder property without telling him, and he had recorded the overheard conversation where my mother Lydia referred to the ranch as a pile of rocks that would eventually pay for their retirement. Every broken promise and every hollow excuse was written in his steady, blocky script. The ledger proved that my grandfather hadn't just accidentally favored me in his will. He had accurately assessed the people who shared his blood and found them wanting. The next morning I found my father sitting on the porch, staring out at the timber with a vacant, hollow expression. He looked like a man who had finally realized the mountain wasn't going to move for him. I didn't say a word as I sat down beside him and placed the notebook in his lap. I told him to open it to any page from the last decade. Garrett's hands, usually so steady when he was pitching a new business venture, were trembling as he flipped through the leaves. I watched his eyes move across the entries. I watched him see the evidence of his own 20-year betrayal laid bare in his father's handwriting. For the first time in my life, the important man facade, the Boulder executive mask, completely broke. The structural integrity of his ego simply collapsed. He realized that Thomas hadn't forgotten him or lost his mind. Thomas had seen him perfectly. He had seen the son who was just waiting for him to die, and he had documented the exact moment that son had forfeited his right to the land. The weight of those 2 decades of calculated distance finally crushed Garrett's spirit. He didn't shout or try to negotiate. He didn't mention the lease or the $300,000 debt. He just sat there, the ledger shaking in his grip, realizing that the person he had been trying to defraud was the only one who had ever truly known him. I looked at my father and felt a strange, cold pity. He had spent his entire adult life performing for an audience that didn't exist, all while the man whose respect he actually needed was taking notes on his failure. Garrett closed the book and handed it back to me, his voice a low, broken rasp. He admitted that he had always thought his father was too far gone to notice the neglect. He had believed he could play the role of the dutiful son for a few weeks a year and reap the rewards of a lifetime of Thomas's toil. But the ledger was an unshakable testimony. It was the silent voice of a man who refused to let his legacy be stolen by someone who didn't value the dirt it was built on. Lydia came out onto the porch, then her face tight with a defensive, jagged anger. She saw the notebook and demanded to know what I was doing to upset him now. She started to reach for it, but Garrett stopped her with a single weary gesture. He told her to leave it alone. He told her that it was over. He finally admitted right there in front of the trees and the wind that they were exactly the people Thomas thought they were. Lydia's expression shifted from anger to a chilling, calculated fear. She didn't have the emotional capacity for the kind of realization Garrett was experiencing. She only cared about the practical fallout. She asked him what this meant for the lease and for Silas's defense fund. I stood up, taking the ledger with me. I told them that the ledger stayed with the ranch. It was the moral foundation of the trust, the reason why Marcus Thorne could defend the will against any challenge they threw at it. I informed them that if they wanted to continue living in the guest cabin, they would follow the rules of the lease to the letter. No more parties, no more city friends, and no more measuring the land in dollar signs. I told them that the ranch was now a place of work, not a hideout for felons. Just as I was about to walk back inside, Brooke appeared at the screen door. She had been listening, her face pale, and her typical bratty confidence nowhere to be found. She looked at her father, then at the notebook in my hand. She asked if Grandpa Thomas had written anything about her. I didn't lie to her. I opened the book to the most recent sections and showed her the empty spaces next to her name. I showed her the years of holidays where the only entry was, "Brooke did not call." The silence of the page hit her harder than any lecture could have. She realized that in the eyes of the patriarch she had expected to fund her life, she simply didn't exist. She was a non-entity, a ghost in her own family history because she had never bothered to show up. The conflict of the morning left them all fractured, but the drama was far from finished. As Garrett walked toward the guest cabin, his shoulders slumped and his head down, a dusty sedan pulled up to the gate. It wasn't Marcus, and it wasn't the sheriff. It was a woman I didn't recognize, dressed in a sharp professional suit that looked entirely out of place in the high country. She stepped out of the car and introduced herself as an investigator from the state's Professional Standards Board. She wasn't there for Silas or my father. She was there for the notary whose stamp Silas had used. The woman told me that the forgery had triggered a massive audit of every document that specific notary had ever stamped. She looked at my mother, then back at me, her eyes narrow and suspicious. She revealed that they had found a series of suspicious transfers from my grandmother's private accounts, dating back 8 years, all authorized by a digital signature that didn't match Thomas's or mine. The skims weren't just a recent act of desperation. They were a long-term systemic theft that had been happening under Thomas's nose while he was busy recording our Sunday visits. I looked at Lydia, who had gone completely still on the porch chair. The color drained from her lips, and her hand went to the collar of her robe. I realized then that the ledger Thomas kept was only half the story. He had been counting the visits, but someone else had been counting the money. The true architect of the family's moral rot wasn't the brothers in handcuffs. It was the woman who had stayed in the house managing the accounts and whispering in my grandfather's ear. As the investigator pulled a folder of bank statements from her bag, I felt the ground shift once again. The silent ledger had broken my father's spirit, but the audit was about to destroy my mother's freedom. The surprising truth was that the victim of the story wasn't just me or Thomas. It was the entire Tmaine legacy, and the betrayal was coming from inside the very room where I had just eaten breakfast. The next conflict wasn't just a legal battle. It was a total collapse of the family unit, and this time, there were no leasable solutions. The fallout from the ledger was only the quiet before the storm that leveled our family standing in Boulder. While the mountain air at Bittercreek remained indifferent to our collapse, the social landscape of the city was far less forgiving. The drama spilled into the public eye when the resort group filed a massive lawsuit against Silas to recover their $100,000 lost deposit. Because the contract was signed under fraudulent pretenses involving the Tmaine estate, the legal proceedings weren't buried in some back-alley courthouse. They were front-page news. Every major local paper carried the headline about the forged signatures and the failed multi-million-dollar land grab. The Tmaine name, which my parents had spent 2 decades polishing to a high-gloss finish, was suddenly synonymous with a cheap, desperate scam. Lydia's status as the self-appointed queen of the country club evaporated with a speed that left her breathless. For years, she had navigated those marble hallways with a practiced air of superiority, her identity fused to the charity boards she chaired and the exclusive luncheons she organized. She lived for the right impression, believing that a designer handbag and a seat at the head of a gala table made her untouchable. But the social circles she curated were built on the same hollow foundation as my father's finances. The moment the news hit her, phone went silent. Her friends, the ones she had traded gossip and expensive wine with for 10 years, didn't just distance themselves. They vanished. Her chair positions on the Arts Council and the Hospital Foundation were filled within 48 hours, usually by the same women who had smiled to her face while waiting for her to stumble. The social dissolve was a brutal clinical extraction of my mother from the only world she valued. She spent her days in the guest cabin at the ranch staring at a screen that no longer lit up with invitations or flattery. She was learning that in modern American society, status is a borrowed luxury that can be revoked without notice. The family that once obsessed over appearances was now the town's cautionary tale, a dark story whispered over cocktails about the dangers of living beyond one's means. Lydia tried to blame the media and the resort group's lawyers, but even she couldn't ignore the way the neighbors in Boulder had turned their backs before the moving trucks had even finished loading their furniture. The conflict moved from the country club to the dinner table when the reality of their situation finally hit Brooke. My younger sister had been the ultimate product of our parents' vanity, an aspiring influencer who measured her worth in followers and filtered snapshots of a lifestyle she didn't earn. She had spent her teenage years being groomed for a world of effortless luxury, convinced that a Tmaine was entitled to the best of everything. When the trust froze the estate and the foreclosure took the Boulder house, her influencer dreams didn't just stall, they died. The brands that had sent her free products suddenly sent termination notices. Her social media comment sections, once filled with envious praise, were now a battlefield of mockery and questions about her father's legal troubles. With no inheritance, no luxury SUV, and no suburban base of operations, Brooke was forced to do the unthinkable. She had to get a job. Because she had no skills beyond curation and no work history, she ended up behind the register at a local grocery store in the valley. The girl who used to spend $500 on a single pair of shoes was now wearing a polyester vest and memorizing produce codes for minimum wage. But the sharpest blow wasn't the work itself, it was the transportation. Without the car, Garrett had promised her, Brooke was forced to ride the public bus to her shifts. I watched her walk down the long ranch driveway every morning, her head down and her shoulders slumped, waiting for a vehicle that represented everything she had spent her life looking down upon. She didn't handle the transition with grace. Every evening when she returned to the ranch, she brought a fresh wave of resentment. She accused me of taking pleasure in her humiliation, claiming that I wanted her to suffer so I could feel superior. I reminded her that I wasn't the one who had lied about the car or the business. I told her that the grocery store job was the most honest thing any Tmaine had done in a decade. But Brooke wasn't looking for honesty. She was looking for someone to punish for the death of her fantasy. The tension between us was a live wire sparking every time we shared a room. She saw my preservation of the ranch as a personal attack on her comfort, unable to comprehend that the land was the only thing standing between our family and total destitution. The drama escalated further when a representative from the bank arrived at the ranch gate. They weren't there for the Bittercreek title, which was safely shielded by the trust, but they were there to serve papers for the repossession of the silver Mercedes my parents were still trying to hide in the barn. Garrett had stopped making payments months ago, thinking the bank wouldn't find the vehicle at a remote mountain property. The scene was a chaotic public embarrassment. Lydia stood in the driveway shouting at the tow truck driver about her rights, while the driver calmly hooked up the car that represented the last shred of her Boulder identity. The neighbors from the surrounding ranches, people who Thomas had known for 50 years, watched the spectacle from their fence lines. The Tmaine family was no longer a legacy of construction and supply. We were a circus. Garrett watched the car being towed away with a dull, vacant expression that was almost worse than his rage. The ledger had broken his spirit, but the social dissolve was stripping away his skin. He was a man who didn't know how to exist without the armor of wealth. Without the business, the house, and the car, he was just a middle-aged man facing a criminal indictment for forgery. He spent his hours wandering the south fence line, touching the posts I had mended, perhaps trying to find a connection to the father he had spent 20 years ignoring. But the land didn't speak to him. It only reminded him of what he had forfeited. Just as the dust from the tow truck settled, Marcus Thorne called me with a new jagged update. The audit of my grandmother's accounts had revealed a second layer of deception. It turned out that the skimming wasn't just intended to pay off Garrett's debts. Silas had been using a portion of the stolen funds to buy silence from a former employee of the construction supply company, someone who knew a secret about the company's final sale years ago. This wasn't just about family greed anymore. It hinted at a corporate crime that could jeopardize the very foundation of the trust's wealth. If the original sale of Townsend and Sons was built on a lie, the entire $4.2 million estate could be subject to a clawback by the original buyers. I stood on the porch looking at my broken parents and my bitter sister, and I realized that the social dissolve was only the first stage of our erasure. We were being dismantled piece by piece, not just by the law, but by the weight of our own history. The surprising ending to the day came when Brooke walked into the house, threw her grocery store vest on the floor, and told me she had been approached by a private investigator at the store. He wasn't looking for our father or Uncle Silas. He was looking for our mother. He had a photograph of Lydia meeting with a known offshore shell company manager in Denver 3 years ago. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The queen of the country club hadn't just been managing the accounts. She had been planning her own exit strategy long before the business folded. The next conflict wasn't about status or grocery stores. It was about a betrayal so deep it made the forgery look like a mistake. My mother wasn't a victim of the collapse. She was its silent architect. The audience would soon learn that the most dangerous person in the family wasn't the brother with the iron bar, but the woman in the silk robe who knew exactly where every dollar was buried. The revelation of my mother's clandestine meetings in Denver and the potential for a total corporate clawback of the Tmaine wealth felt like a second mountain collapsing onto our small valley. Yet as I stood on that weathered porch, looking at the wreckage of my parents' lives, I heard my grandfather Thomas's voice echoing through the timber. He had always insisted that family was defined by who showed up, not by who shared the name. Despite the forgery, the secret debts, and the decades of calculated neglect, I realized that becoming as cold as they were would be the ultimate betrayal of the legacy I was trying to protect. I didn't evict them. I refused to let my mother's panic or my father's hollowed-out stare dictate the next chapter of Bittercreek. Instead, I exercised what Marcus Thorne called the mercy clause. I established a formal grace period, a 6-month window of breathing room, that came with very specific non-negotiable strings attached. The trust would cover the substantial legal fees Garrett was incurring due to his role in Silas's forgery disaster, but only if he agreed to mandatory intensive financial counseling. I wanted him to look at the numbers he had spent a lifetime avoiding. I wanted him to understand that his worth wasn't tied to a silver Mercedes or a suburban zip code. He took the offer with a silent, humiliated nod, the Boulder executive finally admitting he didn't know how to manage a checkbook. It was a clinical kind of mercy, designed to rebuild a man who had spent 40 years being a recipient instead of a builder. For Lydia, the terms were even more pointed. I offered her the role of the ranch's groundskeeper. It was the very labor she had spent a lifetime mocking, the kind of work she once claimed was only for people without an education or a social life. If she wanted to continue living on the land, she would have to earn her place by tending to it. I wanted her to feel the mountain soil under her fingernails and the weight of a shovel in her hands. I called it generous justice. They were being given a chance to remain on the property, but they were going to learn the visceral, bone-deep difference between the price of an asset and the value of an inheritance. They were no longer the masters of the domain. They were the stewards of a history they had nearly destroyed. The conflict shifted from legal threats to the daily reality of toil. Seeing my mother in a pair of sturdy work boots dragging fallen timber from the south fence line was a sight that felt both surreal and deeply right. She struggled at first, her hands blistering and her back aching, her face a mask of bitter resentment every time a neighbor's truck passed the gate. She was terrified of being seen in her new reality, still clinging to the ghost of her country club status. I watched her from the kitchen window, remembering how she used to say that Thomas was wasting his life on this dirt. Now that same dirt was the only thing keeping her from a homeless shelter. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially Brooke, who watched our mother's labor with a mixture of horror and a growing silent realization that the Tmaine name no longer provided a shield. The drama took a sharper turn when the financial counseling sessions began to peel back the layers of Garrett's business failures. The counselor, a sharp-eyed woman who specialized in forensic accounting, discovered that Silas hadn't acted alone in the offshore transfers. She found a series of encrypted authorizations that pointed toward a second device, one that had been active inside our Boulder home for years. While Garrett was chasing bad investments, someone else was systematically hollowing out the family's emergency reserves. My father sat in the ranch study looking at the printouts of the missing funds, his face a map of fresh, jagged betrayal. He realized that the woman he had relied on to manage their social calendar had been managing a secret exit strategy right under his nose. I confronted Lydia in the barn while she was cleaning the stalls. She didn't deny it. She stood there covered in the dust of the life she hated and told me that she had done it for Brooke. She claimed she knew the ranch would never be enough for a girl with Brooke's potential and that she had been trying to build a separate nest egg that the trust couldn't touch. She spoke about the offshore account like it was an act of maternal sacrifice rather than a multi-year theft from her husband and her father-in-law. It was a staggering display of delusional entitlement. She truly believed that stealing from the family legacy was a valid way to protect her favorite child's future. The conflict between my parents turned poisonous. Garrett couldn't look at her, and Lydia stopped pretending to care about his professional redemption. They existed in the guest cabin, like two ghosts trapped in a haunting they had created. The grace period was supposed to be a time for healing, but it was becoming a laboratory for the destruction of their marriage. Brooke was caught in the middle, her grocery store shifts providing a brutal contrast to the high-stakes financial warfare happening at home. She started to pull away from our mother, realizing that the money Lydia had saved for her was stolen property that would likely be seized by the state investigators. The drama escalated further when Marcus Thorne arrived with a new set of papers. The resort developers, realizing they couldn't break the trust, had pivoted. They were suing Lydia personally for her role in the secret meetings in Denver, alleging that she had provided them with confidential estate information to help them pressure Silas into the quick flip deal. My mother hadn't just been a silent architect of the scheme. She had been playing both sides of the fence, trying to force a sale of the ranch so she could take her offshore cut and disappear. The queen of the country club had been the ultimate mole. Garrett's reaction was a quiet, devastating break. He didn't shout. He simply packed a small bag and moved into the old foreman's shack at the far edge of the property, leaving Lydia alone in the guest cabin. He chose the most humble structure on the ranch, a place with a wood stove and a single bed, because he couldn't stand to breathe the same air as the woman who had sold out his family. The mercy I had shown was now forcing them into a level of truth they weren't prepared to handle. They were on the land just as they wanted, but the land was stripping them of every lie they had ever told themselves. As I sat on the porch that evening, I watched the light fade over the peaks. The grace period was only halfway through and the family was already in tatters. I felt a deep sense of peace knowing that the ranch was finally free of the shadows. But the surprising ending to the day came when I checked the mail and found a certified letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. It wasn't about the forgery or the offshore accounts. It was an inquiry regarding a life insurance policy Thomas had taken out 30 years ago, one that had been dormant for a decade. The beneficiary wasn't me, and it wasn't Garrett. It was a name I had never heard before, a person Thomas had kept secret from everyone, including my grandmother. I realized then that the layers of the Tmaine history went much deeper than a leather notebook or a trust document. The next conflict wasn't about the money we knew about. It was about the life Thomas had lived before the ranch became his fortress. The mercy I had shown my parents was about to be tested by a truth that would reframe everything I thought I knew about my grandfather's heart. The weight of the secret life insurance policy and the crushing labor of the ranch finally caught up with Lydia on a Tuesday afternoon. I found her collapsed near the south fence line, her hand still clutching a pair of heavy loppers she had been using to clear brush. The Colorado sun was unforgiving, and her face was a terrifying shade of gray that mirrored the mountain granite. The local paramedics moved with a familiar, practiced urgency, loading her into the ambulance as the siren wailed through the valley. It felt like a cruel irony when the GPS directed them to Millbrook General, the very same hospital where my grandfather Thomas had spent his final weeks. History was repeating itself in the most visceral way possible, pulling us back to the linoleum hallways and the smell of industrial cleaner that had defined the beginning of our family's end. I sat in the waiting room alone for 5 hours, my back against the hard plastic chair and my eyes fixed on the flickering television in the corner. It was the same common room where Thomas used to watch game shows he couldn't hear. I was the only one there. Brooke had called from the grocery store, her voice trembling, but she said her manager wouldn't let her leave her shift early because they were short-staffed. She was finally learning the brutal reality of being an hourly worker in America, where family emergencies don't always stop the clock. But the real silence came from my father. Garrett hadn't answered my first 3 calls. I had to leave a message with the foreman at the supply yard, where he was doing his mandatory counseling. When Garrett finally arrived at the hospital, he didn't come rushing through the doors with the frantic worry of a husband. He walked in slowly, his shoulders slumped, and his gaze avoiding mine. He looked around the waiting room not for a doctor, but as if he were evaluating the cost of the facility. He sat down 3 chairs away from me, the distance between us feeling like a physical canyon. He didn't ask about the diagnosis or if the doctors thought Lydia would pull through her stress-induced heart issues. The first words out of his mouth were a jagged question about the insurance coverage. He leaned toward me, his voice a low, desperate hiss, and asked if the trust was going to cover the medical bills. I looked at my father and felt a wave of cold, crystalline clarity. In that moment, he was no longer the bolder executive or the important man chasing investments. He was a man who only knew how to receive. He saw his wife's potential death not as a personal tragedy, but as a financial liability that might further deplete his shrinking world. He was repeating the exact behavior Thomas had documented in his ledger. While Lydia was in a room down the hall, fighting for her breath, Garrett was already calculating the arithmetic of her survival. He had learned nothing from the ranch, nothing from the forgery, and nothing from the silence of his own father. He was a consumer of other people's lives, a man who had never built a single foundation of his own. I told him very calmly that the trust would pay the bills. I saw the visible relief wash over him, his posture relaxing as if a heavy weight had been lifted. But then I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper that Marcus Thorne had prepared for this exact contingency. I told my father that the payment came with a final absolute condition. If the trust covered Lydia's care, Garrett had to sign a permanent irrevocable waiver. He would have to legally surrender any and all future claims to the Tmaine estate, the ranch, and the investment portfolios. He would be signing away his birthright in exchange for his wife's medical solvency. It was the ultimate test of his character, a choice between his greed and the woman who had helped him skim the family accounts. Garrett stared at the paper like it was a poisonous snake. He accused me of being a monster, of using his wife's illness to finish the job Thomas had started. He started to shout, his voice echoing in the quiet hallway, attracting the attention of a passing nurse. I didn't raise my voice. I reminded him that the trust was designed to protect the assets, and paying for his private debts wasn't part of the mission. I was offering him a way out of the financial hole Lydia's collapse had created, but I was closing the door on his fantasy of a multi-million-dollar windfall once and for all. I told him he had 10 minutes to decide before I walked out and let him handle the billing department on his own. The drama intensified when a cardiologist emerged from the double doors. He ignored my father and came directly to me, recognizing me from my months of visiting Thomas. He told me that Lydia had suffered a significant cardiac event triggered by extreme physical and emotional exhaustion. She was stable for now, but she would require weeks of specialized care and long-term rehabilitation. The cost would be astronomical. Garrett listened to the doctor's report, his eyes darting between the medical professional and the legal document in my hand. He realized then that the life Lydia had built for them, the secret exit strategy, and the offshore skims, was gone. They had no liquid assets left, and the bank was still circling their remaining debts. My father took the pen from my hand, his fingers shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He looked at the door to the intensive care unit, then at the waiver. He signed his name with a jagged, ugly scrawl that looked nothing like the confident signature on his former business contracts. He handed the paper back to me, his eyes filled with a visceral, burning resentment. He told me that I had finally won, that I had successfully turned him into a stranger in his own family history. I tucked the waiver into my folder, feeling no sense of triumph. I only felt the heavy, quiet satisfaction of a boundary finally being set in stone. But the conflict took a surprising turn when Brooke finally arrived. She didn't come in crying. She walked in with a cold, focused anger I had never seen in her. She had seen our father's car in the parking lot and guessed exactly what was happening. She walked right up to Garrett and asked him if he had sold out Mom just to save his own skin. She had heard rumors about the waiver from Marcus's assistant, who was a regular at her grocery store. Brooke didn't look at me as a villain anymore. She looked at her father and realized he was the one who had spent their entire lives trading their security for his own comfort. She told him that she was moving her things out of the guest cabin that night. She refused to live under the same roof as a man who could sign away his family's future in a hospital waiting room. The day ended not with a reconciliation but with a total fragmentation. Lydia was awake, but she refused to see Garrett. She asked for me. When I sat by her bed, she didn't apologize for the skims or the secret Denver meetings. She whispered that she had hidden a second leather notebook not in the tool shed, but in the safe deposit box Thomas had kept in a different county. She told me that if I wanted the truth about the life insurance policy and the secret name, I would find it there. She was giving me the keys to the final mystery, not out of love, but as a final act of spite against the husband who had just waived his rights to her world. The surprising payoff came as I walked out of the hospital into the cool night air. I looked at the waiver in my hand and realized that Garrett's signature wasn't the final victory. The true shock was that the medical bills were already being tracked by a third party. Marcus Thorne called me as I reached my truck and told me that an anonymous donor had already made a massive deposit into the hospital's billing account in Lydia's name. It wasn't the trust, and it wasn't a family member. It was the person named in Thomas's secret life insurance policy. The mystery individual was already moving into our lives, providing a level of protection and observation that made me realize I wasn't the only one who had been watching the Tmaine family fall. The next conflict wasn't about the money we had saved, but about the person who was now willing to spend their own wealth to influence our ending. I realized that the house Thomas built had doors I hadn't even discovered yet, and the person on the other side was already waiting for me to turn the key. The signed waiver from the hospital felt like a cold, heavy stone in my pocket as I drove back to Bittercreek through the blue shadows of the Rockies. Garrett had officially signed away his birthright for a hospital bill, but as Marcus Thorne had noted, the true bill was already being paid by a ghost from my grandfather's past. I didn't wait for the mystery donor to reveal themselves before I began the work of reshaping the Tmaine legacy. I realized that if the money remained stagnant, it would only continue to act as a beacon for my parents' resentment. I needed to move the wealth into a place where their greed couldn't follow. I decided to use a significant portion of the investment portfolio to establish the Thomas Heritage Scholarship. It was a fund dedicated specifically to local students pursuing degrees in forestry, land management, and sustainable agriculture, the very occupations my parents had spent their lives mocking as beneath our family's social standing. For Garrett and Lydia, work had always been something you managed from a glass office or a charity gala board. They viewed the people who actually touched the Colorado soil, the foresters, the hands, and the technicians, as the help of faceless workforce that existed only to facilitate their comfort. By diverting the funds they so desperately craved into the hands of these nobody workers, I was performing a radical redistribution of wealth, based on character rather than blood. I wanted the legacy of Townsend and Sons to return to its roots, to the time when my grandfather built a business on a handshake and the quality of his supply. The scholarship wasn't just a charitable gesture. It was a formal declaration that the Tmaine fortune was no longer a private piggy bank for failed startups and silver cars. The drama intensified when the board for the scholarship met for the first time at the ranch house. I invited Marcus and a few respected community leaders from the valley to help select the inaugural recipient. My parents were forced to watch from the sidelines, literally sitting on the porch of the guest cabin as a fleet of modest trucks and government vehicles pulled into the driveway. Lydia, still pale and recovering from her cardiac event, looked on with a jagged, visible bitterness. She saw the very people she had looked down upon being welcomed into the main house while she was relegated to a groundskeeper's cottage. She didn't understand that these were the people Thomas actually respected. She only saw the money she had skimmed being used to empower the children of laborers. The first recipient was a young man named Caleb, who had worked as a summer hand at Bittercreek for 3 seasons. He was a quiet kid from a family that had ranched in the valley for 4 generations, someone who knew the exact location of every frozen pipe and every rotting fence post on our land. Caleb didn't want the money for a luxury lifestyle. He wanted it to finish his degree in silviculture so he could help restore the timberlands that had been devastated by the bark beetle. When I announced his name, the room filled with a genuine grounded warmth that my parents' boulder parties had never possessed. The conflict reached a new peak when Garrett walked into the kitchen mid-meeting, his face a map of suppressed rage. He had been listening through the open window, hearing the board discuss the allocation of $500,000 for the initial endowment. He stood there in his worn flannel shirt, looking at the scholarship board, and demanded to know why we were giving away his father's money to a stranger while his own family was living in a shack. He turned to Caleb, his voice dripping with a patronizing city-bred disdain, and told him that he was taking advantage of a girl who didn't know what she was doing. It was a desperate, ugly scene that confirmed every reason Thomas had for cutting him out. I didn't let Marcus intervene. I stood up and looked my father in the eye, reminding him that he had signed the waiver. I told him that Caleb hadn't taken anything. He had earned it by showing up for 3 years when Garrett couldn't be bothered to call. I explained that the trust valued the stewardship of the land more than the maintenance of a failed executive's ego. The board members watched the exchange with a chilling, professional silence, their assessments of Garrett's character being finalized in real time. He was a man who would try to steal a scholarship from a kid just to pay off a bad debt. The facade of the important man was gone, replaced by the reality of a small, bitter person who had run out of people to manipulate. Lydia tried to intervene from the doorway, her voice trembling as she asked the board to consider the optics of a family in such distress. She was still trying to use her old socialite tactics, attempting to make the board feel guilty for the Tmaine family's public decline. One of the board members, a woman who had known Thomas for 40 years, looked at my mother and told her very clearly that the only person responsible for the Tmaine optics was Lydia herself. She pointed out that the community had watched me do the work while they stayed in the city, and the community was fully in support of the scholarship's mission. The social dissolve was complete. My parents weren't just losing the money, they were losing the right to even have an opinion in the valley. The drama took a sharper turn when Caleb spoke up. He didn't shout back at Garrett. He looked at my father and told him that he had found a second set of survey markers hidden in the North Timber markers that didn't match the county records Marcus had on file. He said that according to these hidden stakes, a significant portion of the ranch's water rights had been quietly diverted to a neighboring property owned by a holding company. This wasn't a mistake of the land. It was a deliberate legal theft of the ranch's most valuable resource. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. Water is life in Colorado, and without those rights, the ranch's value would plummet regardless of what the trust document said. I looked at Garrett, then at Lydia. My father's eyes widened with a genuine confused shock, but my mother's face went absolutely static. She looked away, her hand going to the doorframe for support. I realized then that the secret exit strategy Lydia had been planning with the offshore accounts was only the beginning. She hadn't just been skimming interest. She had been selling off the ranch's future piece by piece to the very resort developers Silas had been negotiating with. She was the one who had planted the survey markers. The surprising ending to the meeting didn't come from a legal threat. It came from Caleb. He told us that he hadn't just found the markers. He had found the original water compact signed by my grandfather and the state in 1972, a document Thomas had hidden inside a hollowed-out fence post at the north boundary. Caleb had found it while mending the line after Silas's truck crash. He handed me the weathered, plastic-wrapped document, his face steady and loyal. It was the one paper Lydia didn't know existed, and it proved that the diversions she had authorized were illegal and void. The payoff was immediate. The scholarship wasn't just empowering a nobody worker, it was providing the ranch with a defender who knew the land better than the family ever would. By investing in character, the trust had secured the very resource it needed to survive my mother's betrayal. Lydia slumped into a chair, finally realizing that her intricate web of skims and diversions had been dismantled by a kid with a shovel and a degree in forestry. As the board members began to draft the formal complaint to the water commissioner, I looked out the window and saw a black sedan pulling up to the gate. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't the mystery donor. It was the manager of the holding company that had been receiving the diverted water, and he didn't look like he was there to negotiate. The next conflict was stepping out of the car, and this time the war for Bittercreek was moving from the kitchen table to the very water that flowed through its heart. I gripped Thomas's compact, knowing that the scholarship of toil had just given me the first weapon I needed to win a war I hadn't even known I was fighting. The arrival of the holding company manager and the threat of a legal siege over our water rights felt like another storm front hitting Bittercreek. But it was a much smaller, quieter movement that finally shifted the foundation of our house. It happened on a Wednesday evening, just as the long shadows of the Rockies began to stretch across the barn. I was on the porch, my hands still smelling of the pine pitch from mending the very north fence line where Caleb had discovered the illegal survey markers. Brooke walked up the steps, her usual practiced air of defiance replaced by a heavy, uncertain stillness. She wasn't carrying a selfie stick, and she wasn't wearing the designer sneakers that had once been her armor. She looked like a girl who had spent 3 months seeing the world without a filter, and she didn't like what she saw. She sat on the edge of the porch swing, the wood groaning under the weight of 18 years of unspoken resentment. For the first time since the night of my birthday, she didn't start with a demand or a bratty accusation. She started with an apology. It was a jagged, difficult thing for her to say, her voice cracking, as she admitted she had started seeing a therapist through a community outreach program in the valley. She told me she was finally beginning to understand the golden child trap our parents had built for her. She realized that by being the favorite who never had to earn a thing, she had been robbed of her own agency, turned into a trophy for Lydia's vanity, and a pawn for Garrett's perceived status. She looked at her hands, which were stained with the ink of the grocery store register, and admitted that she had been a part of the problem. Brooke asked me if she could work at the ranch for the remainder of the summer. She didn't ask for a loan, and she didn't ask me to dissolve a portion of the trust. She wanted to earn enough money to buy a used car, something reliable that could get her to community college in the fall without relying on the bus schedule. She was offering to trade her remaining pride for a chance at a real foundation. I didn't give her a check, and I didn't offer her a soft position in the office. I walked to the tool shed, grabbed a heavy, blunt-nosed shovel, and handed it to her. I told her that if she wanted to earn her status, she could start by digging out the silt-clogged irrigation ditch near the north timber, the very spot where our mother had tried to hide the water diversion stakes. It was a brutal, clinical introduction to the reality of toil. For the next 2 weeks, I watched my sister from the kitchen window. I saw the golden child of Boulder struggling in the mountain mud, her back aching, and her face flushed with the kind of exhaustion that can't be fixed with a spa day. There were moments when I thought she would quit, when she would drop the shovel and run back to the city to find someone else to manipulate. But she stayed. She dug through the rocky soil and the thick clay, clearing the path for the water Thomas had fought so hard to protect. It was the first time in her life she had ever had to earn her own worth, and as the days passed, the bratty indignation began to wash away, replaced by a quiet, focused grit. One evening, after the irrigation ditch was finally flowing clear, Brooke came back to the porch, her clothes caked in dried mud and her hands covered in fresh blisters. She sat down next to me on the swing, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, we were just sisters. We weren't competitors for Garrett's approval or Lydia's attention. We were just two people sharing the silence of a mountain that didn't care about our former roles. We talked about Thomas not as a source of money, but as a man who had seen the storm coming long before we did. Brooke admitted that she used to hate me for being the one he chose, but now she realized he had chosen me because I was the only one who could save her from herself. The drama took a sharper turn when Brooke mentioned a conversation she had overheard in the guest cabin the night before. She told me that Lydia hadn't stopped communicating with the holding company manager who had arrived earlier that week. Despite the legal compact Caleb had found, our mother was still trying to negotiate a settlement that would grant the developers a temporary easement across the North Timber. Lydia was so desperate for a way back into her old life that she was willing to jeopardize the ranch's physical security for a final one-time payment. She was planning to use the easement as a backdoor for the resort group to bring in heavy equipment before the water compact could be fully verified by the state. I felt a wave of visceral cold anger. My mother was using the very mercy I had shown her to facilitate a second betrayal. Brooke looked at me, her eyes filled with a new protective loyalty, and told me that she had already taken Lydia's phone while she was sleeping. She had found the encrypted messages and the scheduled meeting time for the following morning at the old sawmill ruins. Brooke wasn't just bringing me an apology, she was bringing me the evidence I needed to finish the job. She was choosing the land over the woman who had spent 18 years telling her she was special. The conflict escalated the next morning at dawn. I didn't go to the sawmill alone. I took Brooke and I took Caleb along with the foreman from the neighboring ranch, who had been a lifelong friend of Thomas. We arrived at the ruins just as the holding company manager was stepping out of his black sedan. Lydia was already there, looking frail and out of place in her stained silk robe, clutching a folder of unauthorized estate maps. When she saw Brooke standing beside me, the betrayal on her face was absolute. She screamed at Brooke, calling her an ungrateful brat and a traitor to the family. She tried to claim she was doing this to secure Brooke's car and her future, still using the same old lies that had already failed. Brooke didn't flinch. She stepped forward and told our mother that she didn't want a car bought with a stolen easement. She told Lydia that the golden child was dead, and the daughter who was left preferred the dirt of the ranch to the lies of the city. It was a devastating, satisfying payoff. The holding company manager, realizing that his secret deal was now being witnessed by a group of hostile locals and the legal beneficiary of the trust, didn't stay to argue. He got back in his car and sped away, leaving Lydia standing alone in the ruins of her final plan. The day ended with a total shift in the guest cabin. I informed Lydia that the mercy clause was officially revoked. Her role as groundskeeper was terminated, and she had 48 hours to find another place to live. Garrett, who had been watching from the foreman's shack, didn't intervene. He looked at his wife and realized she was a stranger he could no longer afford to know. He asked Brooke if she wanted to go with her mother, and Brooke's answer was a silent, steady headshake. She chose the shovel and the ranch over the silk robe and the city. But the surprising twist came when we returned to the main house. Marcus Thorne was waiting on the porch with a look of profound, jagged concern. He didn't want to talk about the easement or the holding company. He handed me a small metallic object that had been found during the deep cleaning of my grandfather's study. It was a digital recording device, one that had been active for the last 6 months of Thomas's life. Marcus told me that he had just finished listening to the final hour of the tape. It turned out my grandfather hadn't just been documenting our visits and his son's neglect. He had recorded a final confession from someone who had visited him in the middle of the night, someone we had never accounted for in our family history. The next conflict wasn't about the money or the land. It was about a hidden branch of the Tmaine family that was about to arrive at the gate, claiming that Thomas had a second life we knew nothing about. I looked at Brooke, then at the mountain, realizing that the inheritance wasn't just a gift, it was a key to a vault of secrets that was only beginning to open. The snow had begun to settle into the deeper crevices of the mountain ridges 6 months after the confrontation at the sawmill ruins, turning Bittercreek into a silent white fortress. The chaos of the summer had cooled into a rigid, organized peace, with Brooke now attending her first semester of forestry classes, and Garrett living in a state of self-imposed exile in the foreman's shack. My mother Lydia had vanished into the city after her eviction, her secret Denver meetings having finally severed the last thread of her residency. I spent my Saturday mornings in the quiet of my grandfather's study, a room that still held the scent of aged cedar and the faint metallic tang of the recording devices Marcus Thorne had uncovered. I was engaged in the slow, meditative process of deep cleaning Thomas's heavy oak desk, moving through the artifacts of a life built on construction and secrets. It was while I was polishing the interior of the deep bottom drawer that I noticed the discrepancy. The floor of the drawer sat an inch higher than the exterior frame suggested it should. I pressed against the back panel, and with a soft mechanical click that felt like a heartbeat, a hidden compartment slid forward. Inside sat a single cream-colored envelope, its surface pristine and untouched by the dust of the room. My name was written across the front in my grandfather's steady, blocky script, dated the day before he was moved to the final care facility. My hands were trembling as I broke the wax seal, realizing that this was the one document the state investigators, the resort developers, and even Marcus had missed. It wasn't a list of assets or a set of directions to buried gold. It was a confession. Thomas began the letter by admitting that he had spent the last 5 years of his life in a state of profound, calculated fear. He didn't fear death or the loss of his company. He feared for my soul. He wrote that he had watched Garrett's transformation from a son into a predator, and he saw the same seeds of entitlement beginning to sprout in Brooke. He confessed that he had intentionally cultivated the image of a confused, aging man to observe his family without the filter of their performative respect. He had played the victim to identify the true vultures in his own house. Thomas revealed that the trust wasn't just a way to protect the $4.2 million. It was a shield he had spent years crafting specifically to protect me from being destroyed by my own parents. He knew that if I had inherited the fortune directly without the legal barriers, and the oversight of Marcus Thorne, Garrett and Lydia would have bled me dry within a year. He described how they would have used guilt as a weapon, leveraging their supposed parental sacrifices to guilt me into funding their bad investments and their hollow social status, until I was left with nothing but their debts. He wrote that he had to make me the villain in their story so that I could be the hero of my own. The letter detailed a conversation he had overheard between my parents while he was supposedly napping in his armchair. He heard Garrett planning to use my future college fund to cover a margin call on a tech stock, while Lydia suggested that I didn't need a high-end education because I would eventually just marry into another wealthy family. They were planning to dismantle my life before I had even started it. Thomas wrote that the moment he heard those words, he realized that kindness had become an enabling poison. He decided then to build a legal fortress that would force me to stand on my own 2 feet, knowing that the struggle would give me the grit my father lacked. As I read his words, the resentment I had occasionally felt for the weight of the responsibility finally evaporated. I realized that the paper I had been guarding wasn't just a trust deed or a land title. It was a suit of armor. Thomas had seen the storm coming when I was still mending fences at 12 years old. He had timed the reveals, the recording devices, and the secret ledgers to activate only when I was strong enough to handle the fallout. He apologized for the loneliness he knew the inheritance would bring, but he insisted that a lonely truth was better than a crowded lie. He told me to look at the ranch not as a property, but as a mirror. The drama intensified when I reached the final paragraph. Thomas mentioned that the secret life insurance policy and the mystery donor I had encountered at the hospital were part of a contingency plan he had established with a woman named Sarah Miller. For the first time, he gave me a history of the Tmaine construction supply empire that Garrett never knew. He revealed that in the early days when the business was failing, and the bank was ready to seize his only truck, a local woman had provided the capital that saved everything. She wasn't a silent partner. She was the woman Thomas had loved before he met my grandmother, someone he had stayed in contact with for 50 years. The conflict of the letter shifted from family greed to a hidden parallel history. Thomas admitted that Sarah Miller had been watching the family from a distance for decades, acting as his eyes and ears in the city. She was the one who had informed him of Garrett's secret debts and Lydia's meetings with the resort developers. The mystery donor who had paid Lydia's medical bills wasn't just a ghost. She was the guardian Thomas had appointed to watch over me if Marcus Thorne ever failed. He told me that if I was reading this, it was time to invite Sarah to the ranch. He said she held the final piece of the corporate audit, the one that would determine if the Tmaine wealth stayed with us or was clawed back by the state. I sat there in the fading winter light, the final letter resting on the desk, and I felt a visceral sense of being watched. Not by the ghosts of the house, but by the living people Thomas had woven into my life. I realized then that my grandfather's foresight hadn't just saved the land. It had created an entirely new family structure, one built on loyalty and shared secrets rather than just blood and name. The paper was a map to a world I was only beginning to navigate. The surprising payoff came as I walked to the window to close the shutters against the mountain wind. I saw a set of headlights coming up the driveway, but it wasn't the modest sedan of an investigator or Marcus's black SUV. It was an old, perfectly maintained truck that looked exactly like the one Thomas used to drive. It stopped at the gate, and a woman stepped out, her posture straight, and her silver hair glowing under the yard lights. She didn't wait for me to open the gate. She reached into the hollowed-out fence post where Caleb had found the water compact and pulled out a key I didn't even know existed. Sarah Miller didn't come to the front door. She walked straight to the foreman's shack where my father was living. I watched from the porch as Garrett stepped out into the snow, his face turning a terrifying shade of white as he recognized the woman from his own childhood, the one person his father had forbidden him from ever mentioning. The next conflict wasn't about the trust or the ranch. It was about the secret mother Garrett had been told was dead for 40 years. I realized then that the final letter wasn't just a shield. It was an invitation to a confrontation that would dismantle everything I believed about my own identity. The audience would soon learn that the Tmaine family wasn't just a nest of vipers. It was a labyrinth of hidden lives, and the real war was only just beginning. The sight of Sarah Miller standing in the snow outside the foreman's shack shattered the last of the silence at Bittercreek, but the true revelation was waiting for me inside the main house. While my father Garrett stood paralyzed in the freezing mountain air, staring at the woman he had been told was a ghost, Marcus Thorne called me into the study for what he termed a final reconciliation of the Tmaine history. The room felt different now, the hidden compartment in the desk still open like a physical wound in the wood. Marcus didn't reach for the trust documents or the ledger this time. He pulled out a series of yellowed, fragile ledgers that predated the construction supply company by a decade. He looked at me with a somber, clinical respect and told me that the story of the Tmaine Empire was built on a fundamental gendered lie that my grandfather Thomas had spent 50 years protecting. To the world and to my father, Thomas was the self-made titan who built a fortune from a single delivery truck and a handshake. This patriarchal myth was the very foundation of Garrett's identity and his entitlement. He had spent his entire life trying to live up to the image of the rugged masculine entrepreneur, believing he was the rightful heir to a throne of sweat and iron. But as Marcus spread the old ledgers across the desk, the unseen witness to our family's success finally spoke. It turned out that my grandmother Maggie, whom everyone in Boulder and Millbrook remembered as just a housewife who planted hydrangeas, was the actual architect of the Tmaine wealth. She hadn't just supported Thomas. She had funded him. The ledgers revealed that Maggie came from a family with secret significant wealth, a maritime insurance fortune that she had kept hidden from the public to avoid the social stigma of outshining her husband in 1960s Colorado. When Thomas's initial business was failing and the bank was ready to seize his equipment, it wasn't a handshake or a bailout from a friend that saved him. It was Maggie. She had used her private inheritance to quietly pay off his debts and provide the capital for the first massive inventory of supply materials. The entire Tmaine empire was a matriarchal gift disguised as a patriarchal achievement. Thomas had been the face of the company, but Maggie had been the silent, calculating engine behind every strategic expansion. I stared at the documents, feeling the weight of the irony crushing the very air in the room. My father had spent 40 years attempting to dominate an estate he thought was his father's legacy, never realizing he was actually reaching for his mother's hidden purse. His attempts to leverage the ranch and the portfolios were made even more pathetic by the fact that he was trying to steal a woman's foresight to pay for a man's incompetence. Marcus explained that Thomas had kept this secret not to diminish Maggie, but at her own request. She preferred the quiet power of the hydrangeas and the kitchen to the scrutiny of the boardroom. But Thomas had recorded it all here in these books, ensuring that when the time came, the truth would act as the final judge of his son's character. The conflict intensified when Marcus revealed the final layer of the corporate audit. Because the initial capital was Maggie's separate property, the trust wasn't just a protective shield Thomas had built for me. It was a legal fulfillment of Maggie's original wishes. She had specified in a private memorandum that the wealth should skip the generation of men who didn't understand the toil of building and go directly to the first woman in the family who was willing to get her hands dirty on the ranch. I wasn't just the beneficiary of a grandfather's foresight. I was the recipient of a grandmother's long-term justice. Just as the scope of the deception was sinking in, Garrett burst into the study. He was shivering, his face a ghostly, translucent white after his brief encounter with Sarah Miller. He didn't ask about the woman in the snow. He saw the old ledgers on the desk and demanded to know why Marcus was digging through his mother's personal things. I didn't say a word. I simply turned the ledgers around and showed him the initial deposit slips from 1966. I watched his eyes move across the numbers. I watched the realization hit him that the father he worshipped and feared was actually a man who had been saved by the wife Garrett had dismissed as an afterthought. The important man facade didn't just break this time, it dissolved. Garrett sank into the armchair, the very one where Thomas had sat and watched him with such weary disappointment. He realized that his entire struggle for dominance, the forgery, the secret debts, and the legal battles, was an assault on the very person who had provided him with his life of luxury. He had been trying to strip the ranch from the granddaughter who was following in Maggie's footsteps. The patriarchal myth he had built his ego upon was a fiction, and the reality was a woman's quiet, enduring strength. He looked at the ledgers, and then at me, and for the first time I didn't see a predator. I saw a man who realized he had never truly known his own family. The drama took a sharper turn when Sarah Miller walked into the study. She didn't wait for an invitation. She stood in the doorway, her presence commanding a room that had belonged to the man she loved in another life. She looked at Garrett with a mixture of pity and a cold, sharp familiarity. She revealed that she wasn't just a family friend or a secret partner. She was Maggie's cousin. She had been the one who helped Maggie move the offshore maritime funds into the Tmaine accounts 40 years ago. The secret life insurance policy wasn't a betrayal of my grandmother. It was a joint plan between Thomas, Maggie, and Sarah to ensure that if the business ever fell into the hands of an entitled heir like Garrett, there would be an external force ready to dismantle him. Sarah handed Marcus a final set of papers, the ones that would conclude the corporate audit. These documents proved that the original sale of Townsend and Sons hadn't been a standard corporate acquisition. It had been a structured buyout that allowed Maggie to retain a controlling interest in the holding company that owned the Bittercreek water rights. My mother Lydia, in her desperate attempt to sell those rights to the resort developers, had been trying to sell something that Maggie had specifically locked away for me. The mole hadn't just been betrayed by her daughter. She had been outmaneuvered by a woman who died years ago. The conflict reached a fever pitch when Sarah looked at Garrett and told him the truth about his own childhood. She revealed that Thomas hadn't forbidden him from mentioning her because of a scandalous affair. He had forbidden it because Sarah was the trustee of Maggie's secret wealth, and he knew that if Garrett ever discovered the truth, he would never stop begging for a piece of it. Thomas had protected the secret to try and force Garrett to become his own man, a plan that had clearly and tragically failed. The surprising payoff came as the clock on the mantel struck midnight. Marcus Thorne stood up and announced that the 6-month grace period was over. He informed Garrett that based on the findings of the audit and the terms of Maggie's original memorandum, his residency in the foreman's shack was now subject to a final binding decision by the trust's primary beneficiary. The power had shifted completely. I was no longer just the girl with the last paper. I was the steward of a matriarchal empire that had been waiting for 50 years for someone to finally take the lead. I looked at my father, then at Sarah, then at the ledgers. The payoff wasn't a financial win. It was the total erasure of the patriarchal lie that had poisoned our family for 2 generations. As the winter storm began to howl outside, rattling the windows of the study, I realized that the house Thomas built was actually the house Maggie funded. The final conflict wasn't about the money or the land. It was about what I was going to do with a truth that could either rebuild my father or finish him for good. The audience would soon see that the most powerful witness in the Tmaine story wasn't the man with the handshake, but the woman who had been watching from the hydrangeas all along. I stood up and walked toward the porch, knowing that the Colorado sunset I was about to witness would be the first one I saw, with eyes that were finally completely wide open. I sit on the porch of Bittercreek Ranch, now listening to the rhythmic, familiar groan of the wooden swing. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and the distant metallic tang of the mountain stream that flows freely once more. In front of me, the sun is performing its final spectacular act of the day, dipping behind the jagged silhouettes of the Rockies and painting the sky in shades of bruised violet and burning copper. This land, which was once viewed by my family as a mere line item on a balance sheet or a quick-flip development opportunity, has become my sanctuary. It is no longer a battlefield of forged signatures and secret skims. It is a home restored and protected by the very labor my parents spent their lives trying to avoid. Down in the lower meadow, I can see 2 figures moving through the long grass. My parents, Garrett and Lydia, are finishing their daily shift. They live in the guest cottage, now their residency at the ranch defined by the strict terms of the lease I handed them months ago. They are no longer the masters of the Boulder social scene or the architects of hollow empires. They are workers. Garrett is carrying a heavy post-hole digger, his shoulders broader, and his face tanned by the high-altitude sun. He spent today mending the north fence line, the same stretch of cedar where my grandfather Thomas first taught me the value of patience. Lydia is walking beside him. Her hands, once soft and manicured for country club luncheons, are now calloused and steady. She spent her afternoon tending to the heritage hydrangeas Maggie planted decades ago, finally understanding that the beauty of this place requires sweat, not just observation. They didn't change because of a sudden moral awakening. They changed because American reality finally caught up with them. When the bank took the suburban house and the social circle evaporated, they were forced to choose between the dirt of the ranch and the concrete of the street. They chose the land, and in doing so, they had to accept my rules. There is a strange, quiet peace between us now. We don't talk about the offshore accounts or the forgery over dinner. We talk about the health of the timber and the seasonal water levels. By stripping away their wealth and their status, I didn't just win a legal battle. I gave them a chance to finally become the people Thomas hoped they would be. I broke a generational curse of entitlement that had threatened to hollow out our family for good. Brooke is away at college now, attending her 2nd semester of land management classes. She isn't there on a Tmaine family scholarship or a silver spoon inheritance. She is there because of the work she did in the dirt. She spent the entire summer clearing irrigation ditches and clearing brush, earning every cent of her tuition through the sweat of her own brow. She calls me once a week and we don't argue about cars or followers anymore. She tells me about soil pH levels and the migratory patterns of elk. The golden child trap has been dismantled, replaced by a young woman who knows that her worth is measured by her contribution, not her name. She realized that being the favorite was a cage, and the shovel I gave her was the only tool that could break the lock. As I look at the leather notebook resting on my lap, I realize that the last paper wasn't the trust document or the water compact. It wasn't the waiver Garrett signed in the hospital or the forged deed Silas used to destroy his own life. The most important paper was this ledger of Sunday visits. It was the proof that Thomas had been watching the whole time. It was the testimony that in the end showing up is the only thing that actually counts. He didn't reward me because I was clever or because I outmaneuvered my parents. He rewarded me because I was the only one who didn't view his life as a countdown to a payday. I was the only one who sat on this swing with him when there was nothing to gain but his company. The conflict of the past has settled into a productive working silence. Silas is serving his time, a consequence of the forgery that Marcus Thorne ensured would stick. Sarah Miller remains a silent partner from a distance, her matriarchal wisdom a guiding light for the ranch's future. The resort developers have moved on to other targets, realizing that the legal fortress Thomas and Maggie built is impenetrable. The holding companies and the skimmers have been purged, leaving behind only the soil and the people willing to tend it. The surprising payoff wasn't the $4.2 million. It was the realization that I didn't need the money to be powerful. I only needed the truth. I stand up and walk to the edge of the porch, the evening chill beginning to bite. I look at the old foreman's shack, now empty, and the main house where the lights are beginning to flicker on. I think about the life Thomas lived and the secrets he kept to ensure I would have a foundation. He knew that the only way to save the Tmaine legacy was to let the weak parts of it burn away. He had the courage to be the villain in his son's eyes so he could be the protector in mine. I am the steward of his heart and my grandmother's foresight. I am the unseen witness who finally stepped into the light. The mountain wind picks up, rustling the pines and carrying the sound of the creek through the valley. It is a cold, honest sound. It doesn't offer any false comfort, and it doesn't make any promises it can't keep. It just exists, just like the land. I realize then that the war for Bittercreek is over, and I am the only survivor who truly understands what was being fought for. I am not just a Tmaine by blood. I am a Tmaine by toil. I have earned my place on this mountain, and I have earned the right to watch the sun set without an ounce of guilt. My parents reach the gate and wave a tired, respectful greeting toward the porch. I nod back a simple acknowledgement of our shared reality. They will eat a meal they earned today in a house they are learning to respect. They will sleep the deep, dreamless sleep of people who have finally stopped running from themselves. I turn to walk inside the leather notebook tucked firmly under my arm. It is the only ledger that matters now. It is the map of my life and the record of the people who actually showed up. The final light of the Colorado sunset fades into a deep celestial blue. The stars are beginning to emerge sharp and bright over the timberline. I am Layla Tmaine, and I am no longer guarding a vault. I am living in a home. The inheritance isn't something I'm waiting for anymore. It is something I'm building every single day. I walk into the kitchen, the same room where the screaming started 18 years ago, and I find only peace. I am finally at home, and for the first time in my life I know exactly what that is worth. As the final sliver of the Colorado sun disappears behind the granite peaks of the Rockies, a profound stillness settles over Bittercreek Ranch. I sit here on the porch, the same wooden planks where I once mended fences with my grandfather, and realize that the air finally feels clear. The decade of walking on eggshells is over. My parents are no longer the architects of my identity, and my sister is no longer a competitor for a throne made of hollow promises. I am Layla Tmaine, and I have finally inherited the only thing that truly matters, the right to choose my own life. Looking back at the wreckage of the last few months, I've realized that this journey wasn't just about a $4 million trust. It was a masterclass in the brutal, beautiful reality of human character. Here are the 5 lessons I am carrying forward into this new chapter. Showing up is the only currency that matters. My grandfather didn't choose me because of my DNA. He chose me because I was the only one who didn't view his life as a countdown to a payday. Presence is earned, and loyalty is a verb, not a noun. Boundaries are an act of self-honor. Setting a mercy clause, or a legal perimeter, isn't about cruelty. It is about protecting the foundation of your worth from those who would dismantle it for their own comfort. The difference between value and price. My parents spent their lives measuring the world in dollar signs and marketable status. They never understood that a legacy like a handcrafted oak table or a well-tended meadow has a value that transcends any bank balance. Entitlement is a generational cage favoritism, and golden child status aren't gifts. They are traps that rob people of the grit required to build something real. Breaking that cycle requires the courage to let the fire of truth burn away the lies. Labor is a form of truth. You can't forge the history of a ranch or the quality of a life. The dirt under your fingernails and the calluses on your hands are the only honest witnesses to who you actually are. I look toward the guest cottage where my parents are settling in for the night, exhausted by the honest toil of the land they once tried to sell. I feel no bitterness, only a quiet, grounded clarity. They are learning at long last what it means to be a Tmaine. The porch swing creaks in the wind, and for the first time in 28 years, I don't have to justify my existence to anyone. I am the steward of this mountain, the guardian of my grandmother's secret strength, and the granddaughter who stayed. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to stand your ground against a family that made you feel invisible, I want you to know that you are not alone. Thank you for walking this path with me. If you want to hear more stories of resilience, boundaries, and the long road to justice, please subscribe and stay tuned to Hazel Tells Stories. Until next time, keep showing up for the things that matter.